really everything Nauvoo forward. It just has to be stressed so many times that polygamy was never just marriage. It was the structuring of heaven.
Well, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. My guest today is Cristina Rosetti. She has her PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Riverside. She's done a lot of work and research on the history of the church and polygamy. And with the Declaration number 1, or the Manifesto in the Doctrine and Covenants coming up in Come Follow Me, I wanted to give a little bit more context to the Manifesto itself and put it more into historical terms. And Cristina is the right person to talk about that. I did want to ask you, Cristina, as a practicing Catholic, you talk about how your interest in Mormonism started by reading Richard Bushman, Rough Stone Rolling. And you saw this whole world. It was kind of this 19th century Mormonism, and it was kind of cool to you and intriguing to you. What were your thoughts originally on Mormonism as a whole in regards to polygamy? Because obviously you knew that at least Latter-day Saints weren't practicing polygamy. And I'm guessing growing up where you did, you knew some LDS people. But what was your image of polygamy with Mormonism?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I wasn't actually Catholic at the time, so that wouldn't have really played into it. Oddly, I only knew 3 LDS people like in my life. I didn't really know what they believed. I didn't really know what a Latter-day Saint was. I didn't.
Yeah, because you grew up not far from where I grew up.
Yeah, I did. I knew the captain of the track team was a Latter-day Saint, and I knew that the guy that sat next to me in art class was a Latter-day Saint.
Okay.
I know he ended up serving in Chile, got married in the San Diego Temple. Like his grandparents are like the temple president of City Center. I don't know. I was at a fireside and I was like, there can't be that many people with this last name. And so I just kind of, I didn't really know what they were. I was just like, oh, they're a religious community that's like fairly devout. I mean, he would wake up early to go to seminary. Mm-hmm. And then I picked up Rough Stone Rolling. And I honestly, I guess I kind of was like, the polygamy thing, there it is. But that really was never something I was interested in. Mm-hmm. Just because to be fair, at the time I read that book right on the back of reading about the Shakers and their really strict celibacy. I was also reading about Oneida and their sexual practices. So to be fair, when I got to Mormon polygamy, it really, of all the quote unquote weird sexual practices of the 19th century, it was the most mundane. And so I was just kind of like on the back of Oneida, I'm like, they're okay, like whatever. So I didn't really think a lot of it. It wasn't until later, really looking at the history of it, and kind of really looking at Mormon polygamy as more than just a sexual practice. I know that is the big critique of polygamy, is that it was just about sex. And I would argue that that's not the case. And I think it was when I really looked at what was happening in Nauvoo and what polygamy was part of, that's when the history of polygamy became compelling to me.
Okay. And that's what I'd like to go through here just a little bit. It's just kind of running back all the way to the beginnings here and running up to the Manifesto and then taking it a little bit further beyond that. Going back to the time of Joseph Smith, we know polygamy begins. It's very hush-hush at first. Mm-hmm. Very few people practicing it. We know Hiram was practicing this. I think William Clayton, maybe a few others, but it's not broadly announced to the church. And there's a lot of whisperings in the communities around the Latter-day Saints. It definitely, I'm sure, plays a part in what happens in Nauvoo and to Joseph Smith eventually. Mm-hmm. It's definitely scandalous. It's definitely a conflict that is erupting, but it moves from there eventually. It takes all the way until 1852 for the announcement of Section 132 from Orson Pratt over the pulpit. Mm-hmm. So you go all the way from Joseph Smith's death in 1844, is it? Mm-hmm. I believe, okay, 1844. It's 8 years later that 8 years later that they actually announced this out to the church. What is going on in the meantime during this? How broad does this get up till the time of the announcement from Elder Pratt in General Conference?
Yeah, I mean, polygamy was always a controversial practice, like from the beginning. There was never a time, that's not, a presentist statement. There was never a time when it wasn't. And that accounts for the reason why Latter-day Saints were not welcome in a lot of places. And it accounts for most of what becomes early anti-Mormon literature. And really the reason for that is because Victorian US had a very specific idea of sexuality, that regulation of bodies was really about regulation of sexuality, and it was monogamous, right? The US was a largely monogamous place. For anyone interested, Peter Caviezel wrote what I think is the best book I read in 2020 on really what made Latter-day Saints not Christian in the mind of the US is the polygamy, but not in a way that we can kind of like look at as well, obviously, but in a way that like polygamy wasn't American. It's not that it wasn't Christian to people, it's that it wasn't American. And so that really ends up being detrimental to Latter-day Saints, and it ends up being the reason why it's early on so practiced so quietly among just the anointed quorum. And can't recommend enough for anyone who's interested in the temple. Like, I just need to say, Devery Anderson did a 3-part documentary history. It's not like a book. It's just like a transcription of the sources on the development of the Nauvoo temple and the development of the anointed quorum. Can't recommend it enough to see that this small group of people that was practicing polygamy, they weren't just practicing polygamy. Like they weren't just these like weird off onto the side people doing polygamy. There was more happening that these people were experimenting with religiously, cosmologically, than just polygamy. That polygamy was always about something bigger than just marriage.
So what is happening with the saints more broadly at that time? I mean, how well known is this? Do you know, in your research, do you know how well most of the Latter-day Saints knew about this? And I'm guessing this wasn't something that was part of proselytizing. How many, what is the undercurrent of this at the time?
Yeah, I mean, people knew, but the knowledge of it was known by way of people who were leaving the church. So people were leaving and publishing accounts of what became spiritual wifery. The most well-known case of this was, of course, the Nauvoo Expositor, and what William Law was trying to do by saying, like, look, he's practicing spiritual wifery. He has gone off the rails, like Joseph Smith, whatever. And so really what Latter-day Saints knew about this was known either by way of being formally introduced to the practice, having family members introduced to the practice, a la people like Heber C. Kimball introducing his wife and children to it, or people who were learning about it, becoming disaffected because of it and leaving, and then publishing really scandalous accounts of plural marriage. So that's really, so the picture of it for people who weren't kind of in the know, it was always portrayed in a very kind of negative light.
Was there a large group disaffected by polygamy that left, that ended up leaving, or was it a select few?
It was, to my knowledge, it was always, there was never like a mass exodus over the question of polygamy. It was always certain people. And this includes, people high up in the church. This wasn't just apostles. This was apostles too. This is really the reason why a lot of early groups that become the non-Brigamite sect or branch of Mormonism, a lot of them really begin because of this big problem, like William Bickerton and the Bickertonite movement. Always a hater of polygamy. So we really see a lot of the early schismatic movements, even, the RLDS, now Community of Christ, was largely over not only questions of authority, but concern over polygamy. Really, those are the same question. But a lot of people were leaving, never a mass exodus, except for, of course, after the succession crisis, when we do see the major split between Joseph Smith III and Brigham Young.
There's a question. There was, at the time, the Council of 50 was operating kind of outside of the church. It was built up for, it was organized for the kingdom of God, which is more of a temporal type of a, they were looking to build something up more temporally. Was there a lot of connection there with what those that were practicing polygamy and those that were in the Council of 50?
Yes. The anointed quorum were really a lot of, like, if you were to look at a kind of a breakdown of who was in the anointed quorum, who were apostles, who were in the Council of 50, who were practicing polygamy, you'd see similar names across all. The Council of 50 was really with the goal of creating a theodemocratic settlement under Joseph Smith. Ultimately, this ends up being taken on by Brigham Young and the movement west, although was Zion supposed to be Utah? It was supposed to be California or Oregon.
Should have been. Should have been
us. But from the beginning, polygamy wasn't the central question, but polygamy was the reason for the question of the Latter-day Saints are not doing well anywhere they are, largely because of polygamy, which was the impetus to considering the formation of a separate nation, which does ultimately become the nation of Deseret. And so the Council of 50 was a temporal organization to establish the kingdom of God. But there were theological questions behind that. But there really were temporal important questions based on, this was a community of people that weren't welcome anywhere.
So you, I'm sorry.
The Council of 50, the extent, I want to really highlight the extent to which it was a temporal kind of quasi-governmental organization is really the most emblematic way of describing. There were non-Mormons in it. There were 3 non-LDS people who were members of the Council of 50. They were welcomed in because they were people who exposed plots to harm Joseph Smith. They were people who were very close and friendly to Latter-day Saints. But the Council of 50, the extent to which it wasn't a solely spiritual thing is really signified by the fact that there were Episcopalians in it.
So would you say, I mean, obviously, it seems to me that the Council of 50 is really built of people that are very loyal, right? Joseph Smith can count on these individuals, which would be the same people he would probably introduce polygamy to. I would guess, right?
Oh, yeah. These were people these were ride or die people for Joseph Smith. William Clayton's a funny one because he's told to destroy the records and he ends up just burying them. And that's why we have them now. So his loyalty ended right when it was most important. I mean, thankfully, we're really grateful he did that because the Joseph Smith papers published them, and it's an incredible document that has been really helpful. But these were people that could be trusted. These were not people who were going to become disaffected, and many of them were practicing plural marriage. These were all people, importantly, who had received the early iteration of the endowment, and these were people who were already kind of participating in what becomes the second endowment or the second anointing. So these were people who were highly loyal and highly faithful to not only the church religiously, but also to the establishment of what the church could be in terms of really making a temporal organization.
So I wanted to clarify what you were saying previously. So is it fair to say then that the idea of the nation of Deseret and an exodus out west was driven by the idea that we may not be able to practice polygamy here in the States, and we've got to separate in order to be able to accomplish that? Was that a main driver? Was it just part of it? Was it the main driver?
I would say it was a main driver. At that point, again, I mean, I can't stress enough that polygamy is a marital system. Polygamy has sex involved. But polygamy had become so deeply connected to Mormon cosmology that it really did become, we can't practice our religion if we remain here. And so
when you say cosmology, what exactly are you saying?
That this was ingrained now at this point in Mormon heaven. This was ingrained in what it means to be a person who can ultimately become like their Heavenly Father. This is really completely part of the Mormon worldview. It's not just a marital practice. This is it. Really, I can't stress enough that people have to to understand the weight of really everything Nauvoo forward. It just has to be stressed so many times that polygamy was never just marriage. It was the structuring of heaven.
It was a core tenet that had to be accommodated.
Yes. I mean, this is ultimately, I mean, Joseph Smith kind of really alludes to it, but really under Brigham Young, like, according to Brigham Young, this is how the gods become gods. Like, this is everything. And yes, I mean, the church ends up taking a gentler position later, but especially under Brigham Young, like, this is everything. And I mean, I would argue even that once the saints move west, once Deseret is established, which I would say is largely because of polygamy, Brigham Young ends up instituting the Mormon Reformation, and starting mass rebaptisms based on loyalty, and that's based on polygamy. Like, this is based on who's in and who's out. Like, a line is drawn under Brigham Young and the move west, and that line is, are you willing to do this? Okay. And that's it was a big ask.
Okay. So it's and this is what I think a lot of Latter-day Saints might not understand, just how even though there was a more of a minority that ended up practicing polygamy, it overall, as you say, in the cosmology, it is a core tenet and a core doctrine that the church feels must be manifest and cannot be squashed out by the government. Right. I mean, this is a major conflict that neither side is going to want to turn from.
No.
And so we end up with decades then after that, going from, the 1852 announcement from Orson Pratt, going all the way up until the Manifesto in 1890, of this continual conflict as Utah becomes a territory. It's put under a different governor for a time. It's, there's the assets are taken from the church. So many things happen in this. What really, I think, to me becomes this probably the one of, probably the dominant conflict in constitutional law on the First Amendment with freedom of religion. Where does where does the government need to back down, and how do we protect at the same time the First Amendment as we disapprove of certain behaviors?
Right. And again, importantly, when the First Amendment, there's a whole thing we can talk about with the First Amendment and who intentionally was supposed to be included in that, who wasn't. But really, and I know this is a big, continuing debate, but historically Mormons weren't Christian, right? Like that is the historic stance by 19th century US.
A lot of people still think that.
But that matters, right? Is like,
sure.
Were they even meant to be included in the First Amendment? No, they weren't. Like, that was like, we imagine I think we take our idea of what the First Amendment is now and really apply it back to the 19th century US. No, like, the reality is not everyone was included in the First Amendment back then. Like, the way that we do religious freedom now, we're in a very privileged place of what our freedom of religion looks like. I mean, we have to remember, coming from my own position, there was a time in the US when you couldn't hold mass in public, because freedom of religion really was only about certain expressions of religion, and polygamy really was not covered by this. So the movement out of the United States, and that's an important thing to remember too, is the movement west was leaving the US. They were no longer in the states. They were in now what becomes the Utah Territory.
Right. So up to 1862 here, Stephen Harding, a non-Mormon governor of the territory of Utah, is able to get Justin R. Morrill of Vermont to introduce a bill into Congress. The bill was signed into law on July 8th, 1862 by President Abraham Lincoln. You had a different name for this. I've got the Anti-Polygamy Act of 1862, and it defines plural marriage as bigamy. Talk to us a little bit more about the Act of 1862.
Yeah, so I refer to it as the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, same thing. So the really big thing to remember with the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act is it absolutely passed law. It was designated to force Latter-day Saints to relinquish the practice of plural marriage. What ends up being important here is two things, is regardless of anything else, these are the two things that I think are worth really thinking through. The first is that Latter-day Saints continued to maintain, despite this, that this was a religious principle. The Moral Anti-Bigamy Act really didn't talk about it as religion. And the Latter-day Saints were like, well, this is a religious practice that should be protected under the Constitution. And that's going to become important in a few years. But we have to remember that Abraham Lincoln signs the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, but he never enforces it. Why? Because the United States is in the Civil War. He has bigger things going on. Like, he doesn't care what the Mormons are doing in the Utah Territory. He's in the middle of the Civil War. So yes, the Anti-Bigamy Act is signed, but it carries very little weight, simply because logistically, the United States government was not prepared to deal with it because there was really bigger issues happening. So yes, that is the first piece of legislation, and it's significant, and it's, a hallmark piece of legislation against the church for what it is. But really, there's little teeth behind it, given the historic moment in which it is introduced and ultimately signed.
So obviously, as you said, it's not enforced, so it really doesn't do anything. Right? I mean, nothing really changes.
I mean, that
with
becomes
the Mormon communities.
That becomes like really the trend of Mormon polygamy up until even now, is that it's not prosecuted.
Okay.
Polygamy is not prosecuted. But that's significant too, is that really that sets a precedent for Mormon polygamy is not only illegal, it's also criminal, and it's also not going to be prosecuted. So we're going to so that really sets a standard for what we even see today, that it's illegal, but no one's really doing anything about it.
Okay. Coming up to 1874, George C. Bates, who's the United States Attorney for Utah, and George Q. Cannon are responsible for this idea of bringing a polygamous man, a member of the church, George Reynolds, forward as an example of trying to show that polygamy is under the First Amendment, that it is constitutional because of freedom of religion. Things don't go so well in this attempt. They probably should not have pushed this at the time. And they lose a Supreme Court decision in May of 1879. What happens to the church at this point?
This is a really big landmark court case, even if you're not interested in the church, which your entire audience is. But I teach my students this case with having nothing to do with the church. Reynolds is put forward as kind of like a perfect image of what Mormon polygamy is: American, loves God, all that. And the church launches this legal defense. It takes it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court rules against the saints. And the ruling is important because the ruling clarifies the First Amendment really for the first time on what is and isn't included. And the First Amendment it is decided that the First Amendment protects religious belief under the law, but not religious practice. So according to the U.S. Supreme Court, marriage was a civil contract regulated by the state. Marriage was not a religious principle. And so therefore, marriage is actually not protected under the First Amendment. This is, of course, going to create big questions. This is something we're still talking about, of whether marriage is a state or a religious institution. We're still having this conversation. But at the time, in 1879, the US government basically said, you can believe whatever you want, but you can't do whatever you want. And for a church like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which had a lot of beliefs, of course, but also a lot of unique practices, especially in terms of building Deseret, that really throws a wrench in what religion even is in terms of the US. And this is only going to become more complicated as federal officials are overseeing the territory, because it's not yet a state. So at this point, the whole question of states' rights and everything like that, local matters weren't even really part of this question, because the federal government controls territories.
All right. So with the Supreme Court decision then on this in 1879, a few years later, in March of 1882, Congress passes the Edmunds Bill. And this one does really start to, tighten the screws, so to speak, on the LDS community. Tell us a little bit more about that bill, and what is the reaction of the LDS community to because is this enforced? What is it, and is it enforced?
I mean, the enforcement of polygamy legislation in the U.S. is kind of a joke. Not sorry. Whatever your opinions on that are. 1882 is the Edmunds Act. It does, like you said, start to really kind of like reinforce the state's position. It's not until we're going to talk about a few years later when it actually matters. But the Edmunds Act made it illegal to cohabitate with plural wives. Put a pin in that, and I'll mention something about that in a minute. And what happens is if you are caught cohabitating, you get 6 months in prison and a $300 fine. So that doesn't seem like a lot. $300 back then was a lot. Now, what's a big deal here is the Edmunds Act is really among the first times where we really start to get definitions of what polygamy is. And this is important even now. So in the United States, polygamy is, there's a lot of question on the difference between like polygamy versus polyamory. In the United States, polygamy is cohabitation plus purporting to be married. So it is you can live with like 80 women if you want to. The minute you say these are my wives, that's when it becomes a felony. Again, recognizing that that's a little kind of slippery. So this is really the first moment where we get hardline definitions of what is the criminalized practice within polygamy, what parts of it can be prosecuted. And so this is when polygamy becomes equated with unlawful cohabitation and living with multiple women and claiming them as spouses. So again, importantly, the church never had a system where they were applying for multiple marriage licenses, which is where the bigamy question would have come in. Multiple sealings were never sought as legal. Latter-day Saints were never looking for multiple marriage licenses. And so that makes it particularly difficult for the United States government. And so this is when cohabitation becomes what is the illegal part. Were
they getting any marriage licenses?
Some were.
Even though first wife?
Some were. And I mean, especially, we have to remember that early Latter-day Saints were converts from other religions. And so the general Protestant practice of getting marriage licenses, having marriages be a civil matter was happening. That was just like it is today.
Sure.
That, Latter-day Saints today get marriage licenses and then get sealed in the temple, or I don't know what the new policy is, but that's still, that hasn't changed, that was done then. But sealings were different. And again, this goes back to that this was always kind of more than just an idea of marriage. Sealings were from the beginning treated differently than other marriages. So, and that's still the case in Latter-day Saint cosmology. A civil marriage is different than a sealing.
Sure.
Today, like one carries more weight. So, and that is the other kind of problem in regulation, is that Latter-day Saints recognize that yes, civil marriage is important, but sealings are what are really important. And so the fact that those weren't regulated ends up being a bigger kind of conundrum with the US government, which we're going to get to in a few years.
Okay. So a few years later, then Congress passes the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which tightens the screws even more. Again, this conflict just starts getting bigger and bigger. And I know that there's a lot of political capital, I'm sure, for those that are running for office, in taking on the Mormons, right? I mean, that's a big topic of discussion. I can't remember what it's called. What do they have? The two great sins in America? What was it? Slavery and polygamy, or
the twin relics of barbarism?
Yes. Okay. And so, it's a big political, political issue for those that are running for office, and something needs to be done about it. And so they are. And so in 1887, we've got the Edmunds-Tucker Act. What happens at this point?
Well, so I want to back up real quick to the year before in 1886, because as you mentioned, the Edmunds Act tightens the screws on legislation. The Edmunds-Tucker Act is really the turning point in this story leading up to the Manifesto. But in 1886, the church knew. The church saw this coming. This isn't a secret that the government's after them. So in 1886, the church starts sending people to Mexico and Canada. Most notably, the Romney family becomes one of the big families sent to Mexico. This is why areas in like Chihuahua, Mexico, and especially Alberta, Canada, really become mainstays. Like Reynolds Cahoon gets sent to Canada. And these two areas really become polygamous areas, polygamous Mormon areas, where polygamy is going to continue to be practiced. Yes, Mexico and Canada also have legislation against polygamy, but the global practice of polygamy is kind of a more complicated topic. So the church starts sending them out again to reinforce why this is a central core tenet of the religion. So the United States government is prosecuting it. Things are becoming concerning. And so sending people to Mexico and Canada really became a viable option of considering how can we continue this practice. In the midst of that, the church, the government passes the Edmunds-Tucker Act. And the Edmunds-Tucker Act is a really big deal in terms of not just for Latter-day Saints, but also questions of how church and state issues function generally. So first, the Edmunds-Tucker Act begins by dissolving the church, by dissolving the corporation. It disincorporates the church. That's huge for the government to disincorporate a religion in America. That alone. You know
if that's happened ever any other time?
No. Up until that point, no. Mm-hmm. And this is, I'm gonna make the Edmunds-Tucker Act worse in a minute, but that alone is not only just big for the church, but that's really big for questions of government intervention with religion. So the government disincorporates the church. Then the government declares that they seize all church property over $50,000. Now, what does the church own at this point? The church is a religion of consecration. So this means things consecrated to the church. So when we kind of think today of church property over $50,000, most people would probably think of like meeting houses would be kind of like the first thing. But we have to remember, in a church that was practicing consecration, this includes farmland. This includes major sources of revenue. This includes dairies. This includes mines. This includes everything. But really significantly, this includes the temple. And so all of a sudden, the place where not only where polygamy happens, but where Mormon cosmology is made, where families are forged, where really the entire Mormon religious system happens, is going to be taken by the government. So that's like, you can't stress enough. The Edmunds-Tucker Act was such a big deal. And it really set a precedent for what the government could do to religions that didn't comply. Now, importantly, at the time, plural sealings generally were done differently. Joseph Smith's plural sealings didn't happen in the temple. Many of them happened, I kind of joke down by the river, but it's true. Louisa Beaman was married on the riverbank. So they were happening everywhere. So the temple wasn't just a polygamy issue, but for any Latter-day Saint listening who loves the temple, the idea of the federal government coming in and confiscating all of them, like that's insane. And so this is where the church really starts to be like, oh, like we have to do something. And
then women are not able to vote either.
Yeah. So, the voting issue in Utah is also so strange because, in Utah right now, a lot of people celebrated, first to vote. And that's true. Utah as a territory Utah gained, women were given the right to vote in the Utah territory. The United States government really kind of used polygamous women as a pawn on this, thinking that if we give women in the territory the right to vote, maybe they'll just get rid of polygamy themselves. In this great turn of events, women in Utah voted to retain the practice of polygamy, and the government was like, dang it, and actually took away their right to vote. And so nationally, really, when people think of who were the first women to get the right to vote, most people would say Wyoming, because Wyoming is the first state. But what's often historically forgotten is that the Utah territory was given it, and then it was taken away from them. And a lot of plural wives went to Washington, D.C. to like talk about polygamy. Emmeline Wells, like a lot of, really well-known early Mormon women were really involved in the suffrage movement. And there's a lot of really interesting debate over, secular suffragists and Mormon suffragists. And all of a sudden, all these secular suffragists were like, wait a minute, we have to work with polygamist women? What? Like, what even is early feminism? And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff about that.
That is very interesting. Yeah.
But the government had a rough go on that of being like, well, let's try using women to get rid of it. And so that's another important thing, is that Mormon women have always been kind of used in the Mormon polygamy debate on all sides, especially with the government, of we need to protect Mormon women, and then we're going to use them to get rid of polygamy, and then they didn't do what we wanted, and it's been a mess. So multiple attempts were made to get rid of polygamy. The Edmunds-Tucker Act is kind of the biggest threat that the government could have done. And again, disincorporating a religion, that's big.
Now, later on in that year, July 25th, President John Taylor dies while he's in hiding. Why is he hiding at this point? This is let's see, March, April, May, June. This is 4 months after the Edmunds-Tucker Act.
John Taylor is not going to renounce polygamy. John Taylor is incredible. And we have like an incredible biography on Joseph Smith. We have an incredible one on Brigham Young. Like, it's time that we get the John Taylor biography. He is willing to die for polygamy. He says it. He says that he will reign under the banner of heaven or nothing. Like, he says over and over, the kingdom of God or nothing. Like, he is fully prepared to have the Latter-day Saints renounce citizenship, renounce statehood, renounce everything for the cause of polygamy. Like, he cares about the retaining of polygamy. And so that's kind of, in my mind, my like nostalgia for John Taylor, that's almost like kind of makes it more tragic that polygamy ends soon after he dies. Mm-hmm. Because he really was, he dies in hiding. He's estranged from his community. He's been really pushed out from everything. And then, he was already, John Taylor had seen a lot. Like, he was very good friends with Joseph Smith, watches him die in front of him. Like, this guy's been through the ringer in terms of being devoted to not only the religion, but also polygamy. And so he ends up dying soon after. And in the midst of this, multiple people had come to him trying to figure out what to do. George Buchanan was in the midst of trying to figure out, like, what are we going to do in terms of this? And John Taylor really held the line of saying, this is bad. The government's coming after us, but we have to hold the line, and we cannot renounce this principle.
So a few years later, we end up at the Manifesto here, September 1890. Would you say then, with your feelings on John Taylor, that the difference is the man, or is it those few years of execution of the Edmunds-Tucker Act that just finally says to Wilford Woodruff, fine, I'm crying uncle here, this is it?
I'm not a Latter-day Saint.
No,
so
we know that.
Okay, so I don't view the Manifesto, spoiler, as given by God.
Right.
So kind of like this vision, I think there was a time when I had this vision of John Taylor being and I still call him the last of the badass prophets, because I just, and I think there was a time where I kind of early on in my like study of Mormon history, where I had this vision of Wilford Woodruff truthfully being a little wormy and just kind of like succumbing to the government. But the more that I've read and learned about post-Manifesto polygamy, I kind of really see them as the same person. That Wilford Woodruff signed it to protect his faithful, to protect his buildings, to protect the church, but he never meant to enforce it.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So you think that early on, because the history kind of shows that, right? Up until those last few years. And
there's such this debate over, is it revelation or policy right now in the church, especially. And I think, and early on, people have been having this conversation forever, especially in the Manifesto. And I think that this is a really like important example of it doesn't matter in terms of not in terms of, you know, saying whether it's revelation doesn't matter, but this is a president and a prophet doing really the thing to preserve his church. While he never, if you read the language of the manifesto, and this is, so I mentioned 1886 really intentionally, because if you read the language of the manifesto, it says no new plural marriages will be solemnized in the US. And so there has been a lot of discussion over Wilford Woodruff's own position, whether he ever intended it to be something enforced, whether he believed it was a policy, and all of that. And so in my mind, I do think it was a political move to protect a lot. And really, I mean, we have to remember too, that this isn't just about, you know, the disincorporation of the church and people going to, I mean, George Buchanan went to prison. Like, people were going to prison. Families were being broken apart. This wasn't just about the temporal keeping the buildings, the money loss. Like, he's seeing his faithful getting, their families getting destroyed. And
they're going to prison. Where are they going to a federal prison?
And so what is Wilford Woodruff going to do? I mean, there's, you know, John Taylor's position of, I'll die for this, is great. But what about all the other people that are under his stewardship? So Wilford Woodruff signing this, I mean, the reality is Wilford Woodruff didn't do sealing cancellations of himself, right? He didn't dissolve his family. And so I think it really matters there that if it was just a policy, quotes, if it was just political, he had something at stake and really preserve, like, the religion would not have survived had he not done it.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So the manifesto comes out. What does this mean to the government at all, or if anything, at this point? Because if he feels, is this just an announcement to the Latter-day Saints that, hey, we have to change, this is what we're doing? Or is this an announcement to the government, or both?
So it is announced over the pulpit. But it's announced, but we have to remember at that time that the pulpit, the LDS pulpit, was really the center of the national stage over the question of a lot of things. Statehood is also on the line. We have to remember that the church gets statehood very soon after. So the whole nation is watching. This isn't just, you know, now General Conference, yes, many people tune in, right? Many people tune in who aren't LDS. But when this was happening, the nation was watching of what are they going to do? And so when it is spoken over the pulpit, yes, he is speaking to the faithful, but he's speaking to a nation that is watching to see what their move is going to be, that they've been handed this deck. What's their move?
Okay. Well, their move is how much of it is just words here, and how much of it is actually practice in 1890?
Ending polygamy is hard. The end of polygamy is hard. And we have, again, can't stress enough that this is, that the gods are polygamous, right? At this point, in 1890, we have, I think we kind of, because the LDS Church has really kind of moved away from the Journal of Discourses, there's kind of this vision of Joseph Smith's teachings on polygamy, and then there's a large gap, and then there's the current church teachings on polygamy, and we really kind of forget the additional teachings that were happening, especially under Brigham Young and John Taylor. And so at this time, it's not just that people are doing plural sealings. By 1890, Jesus Christ is a polygamist in the mind of the faithful. God, Heavenly Father, is a polygamist. You have to be one to become like God in the mind of Brigham Young. So like, it's not a small potatoes doctrine by 1890. It's not what it was in Nauvoo. Like it had snowballed into something that carried a lot of weight. But on top of that, in addition to the spiritual things behind polygamy, mass divorce is a logistical nightmare. Like, what do you do, right? I mean, how do we, as a nation, how were we really actually expecting this to work, right? If you're a man and you have, let's just go with 3, right? Like, let's go with 2, right? Let's just go 2, something super easy. You have 2 wives and you have 10 kids, right? We're really asking them to like abandon one, and now she has to fend for herself with like no income. And what are her children going to do? Like, what is it that the government was asking in terms of this? There was this big ask of end the practice, but there was nothing in terms of this is how you're going to make these people survive.
Did the government have anything in mind?
No, there's no social safety nets in term at this point in 1890 especially for women, and so now we have this scenario where people are just supposed to like dissolve their seal, do mass sealing cancellations, and abandon their children. I don't know of any faithful Latter-day Saint that would look back on time and have been okay with that happening, and that was actually the case on the ground. Is that after the manifesto, there are records of church leaders in meetings with men condemning men who abandoned their wives, because that's not, I mean, even in the current Temple Recommend interview questions, there's a question of, do you have financial responsibilities to children, right? Or to, sure. I think well, I don't know what the language is, but there's something about that. I think in general, we would frown upon this happening. And so again, the church actively was condemning people who were opting to abandon their wives. Now, there were multiple solutions. There were, yes, families that chose to dissolve their plural sealings. That happened, and I don't want to discount that reality. There were families that chose to have the husband cohabitate with the first wife or with a specific wife and still financially support the others, but not live with them as a spouse. And then there were others that just kind of were like, we're not going to end polygamy. So there was different ways. There's a lot of options because not even the church gave a unified stance on what you're supposed to do now. There was no... that what people read with the manifesto, there was no secondary supplemental document on here's how to navigate the end of your marriages.
Well, especially like you said, if they're actually thinking, you know, if Wilford Woodruff is actually thinking, well, maybe this is something temporary even, right? Or this is only for the survival. And I've got X amount of people up in Alberta. I've got X amount of people down in Mexico. Right. Maybe we have to move to Mexico, everybody. So you know, there's probably not a whole lot of, is there a lot of enforcement from the church?
Well, no. And so, I mean, what makes this more complicated is that we know between 1890 and 1903 that the LDS Church officially sanctioned at least 25 plural marriages in the temple.
25. Okay.
So that's the number on the ledger. The problem with that is that there are multiple additional plural marriages that were done not being officially reported by the church, because even at this point in 1890, sealings could happen outside of the temple. And so the official church ledger of temple records shows 25, but we do know that many more were happening in addition to that outside the temple. Okay. So but we do know, but
maybe as long as there was the right authority, then
right. And so this is also like a really big, this is where we, I mean, in addition to like the polygamy question, this is where we really start to get big questions of who holds sealing authority, who can perform sealings, who can perform plural sealings, what is happening there, and who is a sealer in the church, like who holds those keys. We're really having to navigate and like concretize all those roles. But the bare minimum number reported by the church is that 25 did happen in the temple.
And what length of time?
From October
13 years?
October 8 to 1903.
Okay, so would you guess then that there was, though, a decrease in the number of plural marriages?
Of new plural marriages?
Of new plural marriages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So there's some effect that the manifesto has in the behavior of the church in terms of plural marriage.
Yes, there was definitely a decrease for sure. And then we'll see that decrease has only continued until it does officially end. But we do know that there were church sanctioned plural marriages. They're called post-manifesto plural marriages that did happen and that were solemnized by the institution.
And then, of course, they're also happening in Alberta and
Yes. Oh,
in
yeah.
Chihuahua.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. That never ends.
Yeah. And these are members of the church, and they are going to church, and they're active members of the church. And
oh, yeah. So everyone between the 1809 and the 1903 period were active members of the LDS Church. There was no kind of what becomes the fundamentalist movement isn't even on radar of happening.
Right. So the church knows this, right? The church knows that this is going on.
Yeah, these are happening in the temple.
Yeah.
Sanctioned by the church. But also, I mean, again, we have to remember that not only is there this spiritual problem of people believing what Brigham Young said about polygamy, not only is there the temporal problem of what do I do with my second wife and my children, but we also have to remember that people are watching their leaders, and their leaders are still polygamist.
Sure.
And so, and that matters in a religion that everyone watches President Nelson in terms of, and what's he doing? Everyone, these are exemplary figures of how do you be a Latter-day Saint? And so long as they have not dissolved their plural marriage is still fine. Leading by example matters in religion, turns out.
Well, and, obviously with President Nelson and President Oaks, I mean, you've got an example, at least, of maybe not a temporal plural marriage, but you've got a celestial, eternal plural marriage there, where they're sealed to two different women.
I mean, yes. I mean, the reality and that's a bigger debate on, is polygamy over in the church? I mean, as long as 132 is still there and men can still be sealed to multiple women, there's that big question. But especially in this time, in the 1903 becomes really kind of a mess. The church is really struggling. And Marianne Watson has this great article, and she calls the period between she calls the 1903 period that by 1903, the church had been struggling to convince a doubting nation that they had ended the practice, because really even the nation didn't believe it. Okay. They got statehood. They got the important things out of this. The church was fine. The temple was fine. They've got
their possessions back. They've got title back on their properties.
They're fine. Utah got statehood, but the nation was still that was a wink and a nod move. We know what's going on. And this will come to a head in 1903.
Okay. So during this time, I want to say it's even before 1903, you've got Smoot, who is being brought to Washington. There's the Smoot hearings. And again, he's not American, so to speak. Right. And this is somebody that we don't want to allow into the Senate. And so what is again, you have this play going on here between the government and between the church. And shortly thereafter, I want to say Smoot starts in 1902 as a senator, I think it was. And you say that 1803 is a big year. But it's 1904 where Joseph F. Smith goes out and makes what I guess is called the Second Manifesto at this point. So bring me through that. 1902, Senator Smoot. 1903, I don't know anything about, you say is important. And then going to 1904 with the Second Manifesto.
So like you mentioned, Reed Smoot was heading to the Senate. And in the midst of this, the new marriages becomes a source of speculation, because at this point, the government is you went from in 1890, you ended the practice, but we're still seeing them happen. So whether or not they're happening wasn't the speculation by the US government. What was speculation is whether the church knew that it was happening and whether they were supporting it. And so in light of the Reed Smoot hearings, the US government ends up bringing leaders of the church in to get testimony of whether or not polygamy is still happening in the church. Kind of the most well-known leader to take the stand is, of course, Joseph F. Smith, who becomes the president of the church, who is the president of the church. And he takes the stand to testify, and he's asked, are you cohabitating? Because again, that's what polygamy is defined as at this time. And he has to acknowledge that he was. And so again, this is the president of the church in 1904. He's further asked, are you fathering children since the manifesto in 1890 with your plural wives? And the answer is yes. So at this point, this is a big deal. Now, that's fine because the manifesto, I mean, whether you want to say that's fine because the manifesto said that they weren't going to continue to solemnize plural marriages. Joseph F. Smith was already a polygamist. So the issue in 1903 becomes, are new ones happening, not did the ones from the past stand? And so in order to kind of end this questioning, Joseph F. Smith, who had just testified in March 1904 before the Senate, takes to the stand in April 1904 in General Conference and releases what now is the second manifesto, saying now we're really done. So again, under really important government conversations, this is a Senate hearing for a Mormon to become a senator. The president of the LDS Church, testifies in front of the Senate and now stands in front of conference in April and says, we're done. We're no longer going to do polygamy. There's more winks and nods. But for the most part, polygamy really ends in 1904. 1904 is really controversial, though, because even within the quorum of the 12 apostles was really fragmented over this. But 1904.
Well, you have a couple of apostles that resign a year later.
1906, they resign.
Okay.
John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley, Matthias Cowley, I very often refer to him as really the leader of the Mormon fundamentalist movement, because he's just going for it, sealing everyone to make sure that this principle continues. And so they did end up they ended up resigning from the quorum, but even the contention in the quorum really becomes a point of questioning among a lot of saints at that time who maybe weren't concerned. I mean, I'm writing a biography right now of a Mormon who becomes a Mormon fundamentalist. And to kind of give a picture of what 1904 was like, he was practicing polygamy because he had been sealed prior to the manifesto. And in his diary, April 1904 comes up and there's a clipping from the Deseret News saying second manifesto. And his diary entry for the day is just, Joseph F. Smith talked on the pulpit, said we're not going to do polygamy anyway. And then he continues to live his life with his plural wives. And he gets sealed in 1906 under the sealing authority of Matthias Cowley in his house. So to a fourth woman. So does polygamy end in 1904? I don't know. But institutionally, I would say institutionally, yes, there were two rogue apostles that really made that tricky. But 1904 is really a solid end. Okay.
So moving all the way to 1933, then another line is drawn.
This one's a big one.
What, now it really is stopping. What's been going on here at this time? We talked a little bit about from 1890 to 1904, but from 1904 to 1933, what's happening in terms of plural marriage? Let's just talk about the U.S. How many people are still getting married and in plural marriage, and why do they have to have another announcement in 1933?
That's a good question. So again, I want to emphasize that 1904 really is I would say it's very fair to say the LDS Church does end polygamy in 1904. However, as we know, what people do and what their leaders tell them to do are very different things. We know this from things as simple as drinking coffee, right? And as extreme as practicing polygamy. And so again, there's a lot of reasons why, but people were still practicing polygamy. Like I mentioned, the man I'm writing a biography on, he ends up getting excommunicated in 1926 for continuing to practice, for continuing to take additional wives. And he was a patriarch. He was a 70. So it was still happening. And he wasn't alone. So there were men who were, for lack of a better word, going rogue and continuing to practice polygamy. Again, John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley didn't help the situation because they were performing plural marriages by their authority as an apostle. So there were people who were continuing the practice of plural marriage. At this time, this is going to present a problem because I can send you this is a sidebar, not to be included. I can send you an article I wrote on the impact that excommunications in the 20s had. The problem with this is now the church puts itself in a bind, because in the 1920s, they're excommunicating people for continuing to practice polygamy, for, the language is for practices unbecoming of a member of the church. And now, especially in Utah, we have an institutional church that is no longer practicing polygamy and a bunch of people they've kicked out for all doing the same thing. Do we see the problem with what that's going to do? So we have the church saying we don't do this anymore and kicking out a lot of people for all doing the same thing who were all leaders in the church and all think they're religiously correct. They're going to start meeting and like hanging out together. Like all these people are going to like get together in each other's house. And that's exactly what happens. So in the 1920s, a lot of LDS people who were just recently excommunicated and are now not only without a spiritual home, but they're also angry at the institution. They all start meeting and talking about the importance of continuing polygamy. And so 1926, they're all chatting. An LDS man named Nathaniel Baldwin, the inventor of headphones, he ends up saying, I'll donate all the money I make for headphones to support whatever you're going to do. And so they all start publishing pamphlets on the church being in apostasy. And this is where we really get the beginning of what becomes the Mormon fundamentalist movement. And it's because of that, this like late 20s issue, Heber J. Grant sees this happening. And importantly, Heber J. Grant was a polygamist at one point, but by the time he becomes a president of the church, all his plural wives have passed. So he's now a monogamous. And he recognizes that the church is no longer practicing polygamy, but these people over there are going to cause problems because there's a lot of them now. They're publishing, they have money behind them with headphones. And that could pose a potential issue in terms of people's perception of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. And so because of this, in 1933, Heber J. Grant takes to the pulpit at General Conference, and he instructs all stake presidents to excommunicate anyone practicing polygamy. And he also instructs Latter-day Saints to do what they can to work with law enforcement to begin the prosecution of polygamous people in Utah.
Okay, so just tightening the screws more.
And that's colloquially referred to as the Third Manifesto.
Okay, Third Manifesto. And then in 1940, we get the Temple Recommend question, which is oftentimes looked at more as like, do you affiliate with some apostate groups? But originally, this is really focused on polygamous groups.
Yes, and again, there's no polygamist church at this point. What people know of as the Apostolic United Brethren, the FLDS, any of those don't exist yet. Those organizations aren't incorporated until the late 70s through the 90s. These are just kind of, at this point in the 1930s, 40s, it's really just like a ragtag group of polygamous Mormons who, because of Heber J. Grant's message over the pulpit, do start to meet and buy land on the Arizona Strip and move away from the center of Salt Lake City out of this deep concern for what Heber J. Grant is potentially doing.
Well, Cristina, we appreciate your time. Is there anything else you wanted to get in on the manifesto before we end here?
I would just encourage people to read the second one. A lot of people are going to be reading the first manifesto, of course, but I think the second manifesto of 1904 is an equally significant historic document that has its own really important history.
Okay, I'll make sure I put that link in the description. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it again. And for those of you that are listening, we did another interview about a year ago. I'll put the link to that interview in there as well.
Thanks so much.